You've got a lot of choices for action games on the NES, but have you ever played Totally Rad? Some give it a good deal of flack, partially because it's complete with incredibly dated surfer talk, but it has all the basic shooting and jumping you'd expect for an action title. But is it a game worth adding to your totally gnarly NES collection, dude? Let's take a quick look and find out. Totally Rad is an action game where you jump through short, basic levels, blasting magic to avoid hazards and destroy enemies. You play as Jake, the student of the great Zebediah, who must rescue his friend Allison and her father from strange underground monsters who just want to learn about people. Okay, so the story of Totally Rad? Not totally important. On the surface, Totally Rad is just what you'd expect from an NES action game. Jake has a basic magic attack he can charge up to do more damage and to cut through more than one enemy. He's a little sluggish, apparently because he takes very little exercise, but he still manages a decent jump. Enemies are abundant with weird soldiers, baddies and hover units, missile launchers, big chin guys, and more. Most baddies are easy enough to take out, but some are a little too wily to hit reliably or a little too slippery to pin down. If you just try to run through a level just jumping and shooting, you'll soon find yourself in a game of attrition you are going to lose. Enemies don't drop recovery items, so if you want to recover any health, you'll need to resort to magic. Jake's magic lets him do several things. First, there's 2 options for recovery, a spell to stop time, and even one to turn invincible for a moment. But there's also devastating attacks that damage every monster on screen. And while old Zeb says some spells are bogus, all 4 elemental spells seem to do heavy damage or at least clear the screen. They all cost the same, so pick your favorite, I guess. Naturally, each spell costs magic power, which cannot be replenished until you hit a checkpoint, so it's not intended to be used similar to something like Mega Man's sub-weapons. If you run out of magic, you're basically out of options until you reach the end of the current round. And with the amount of damage baddies can do when you only have 6 points of health, you'll need to be a little conservative with the spells. After all, you don't want to be without the ability to heal when you need it most. Aside from the healing spells, the most useful spells come in the form of Jake's transformation spells. You can turn into an eagle man and fly through most of the stages pretty easily, save for the later ones where spikes adorn the top of most of the ceilings. And if you need to swim, which is really only useful in the 3rd level, there's the fish man. But he does have the fastest shooting speed, which makes him a little bit more useful in other situations. And lastly, there's the lion man, which allows Jake to jump a little higher and also makes him invulnerable while in the air. It also makes his attack a little stronger, though it now has an incredibly short range. Despite that, the lion transformation is probably the most useful, since it lets you dodge almost anything just by jumping. In the areas where you can't just jump through, you can cast that quick invincibility spell to negotiate the hazards. Some have called Totally Rad a Mega Man clone, and I think that's extremely unfair. Totally Rad is arguably an easier game where there's less precision required, there's not really a whole lot of careful platforming happening here, but you have to be more careful with your resources if you want to see the end of the game. Sure, Jake has some fantastic abilities, but he also starts the game with all of them, and basically needs them to progress through the levels, while the Blue Bomber can handle himself pretty well with just his Buster Gun. One thing that is pretty cumbersome in Totally Rad is that you must select the shoe icon, yeah, that's a shoe icon, trust me, to turn back into normal Jake when you're transformed before you can cast any of the other spells. That means if you're low on health in another form, you'll need to quickly cast the spell to turn back into Jake, pause, select the health spell, and then cast that. Simply allowing the other forms to cast the spells or making even the select button return you to normal would have been a lot simpler, and for a 1991 NES game, I'm surprised that it's this strange. Bosses in Totally Rad are gnarly huge and totally impressive in design, and by impressive I mean absolutely wild. Their patterns aren't terribly difficult to get a basic grip on, and you can beat them decently enough as just normal Jake, but some are easier with one of his transformations. I did find some of the sub-bosses to have a pretty good spike in difficulty though. This guy on stage 5, for example, gave me no end of trouble. Stage design is also relatively simple with basic environmental hazard and extremely basic platforming. But it's those tight bits where you need magic to avoid taking damage that really got me. But once you stop thinking you need to charge through the levels like you might in any other NES game and start thinking about how to use the magic transformations, you'll find ways to negotiate the gauntlet just fine. Thankfully, control-wise, Totally Rad works totally fine. While a little annoying that you cannot hold a charge shot and jump in the air, you won't find many enemies that need Jake's full power up there. Slowdown from the amount of enemies on the screen can be pretty frequent, but if you're an NES fan, you've probably learned to accept this. I think where Totally Rad does well are decent boss fights, short but not terribly difficult levels, and while sometimes annoying or creepy, the cutscenes are at least kind of cute. Zebediah is creepy and the plot is totally not rad at all, which is a shame. It's clearly a shorter and easier game and aimed at a younger audience, I think, but maybe Totally Rad could have been on the level of something like Vice Project Doom, which released the same year and was from the same developer. Now that's a Totally Rad game. I like Totally Rad as a game to pick up and play for a little while. The music is good, and as a late-era NES release, the game is full of color and there's some great animations for the stages. Plus, the bosses are just insanely strange and really unique, which adds to the charm. Originally, the Famicom version of this game was called Magic John, and instead of teens baked out of their gourd, they're actually children, and Zebediah is named Pong, which explains the symbol on his hat. But in 1991, I guess the gnarly surfer talk was in, and Jellicoe wanted to make sure radical teens dug their totally hip and tubular game, dudes. So out with the uncool Magic John, and in with Jake and Zebediah's Totally Rad magic. Other than these cosmetic changes, nothing is all that different between these two versions, and with an English fan translation of Magic John available, you can decide how tubular you desire your Totally Rad experience. So is Totally Rad worth a spot in your NES catalog? I think so. It's got a charm that's a little hard to describe, and while the story, the surfer talk, and Zeb's creepy face aren't part of the real charm for me, Totally Rad's transformation magic forces you to consider how you'll pass parts of each level. And that challenge can be a fun, out-of-the-box way of approaching gameplay.